Buddy, thank you for joining us. As Judy mentioned, today we're going to talk about spray booth inspection for compliance. Take a look at some examples of issues people had, try and learn from them to see what could be avoidable in the future. My name is John Owed. I have responsibility for sales and marketing at Colmet. This is a picture of our facility. We're located in Rockwall, Texas, which is just east of Dallas. We do have an open door policy, and certainly we would invite anybody to come visit us. In the fall, we hold our distributor training. Unfortunately, this spring, we weren't able to do that because of current circumstances, but we're hoping to be able to resume that in the fall. And, that was kind of the advent of the Colmet Academy, was to make up for not being able to have our training. When we look at the Colmet business overall, there's three main business segments: our core catalog equipment, our engineered projects, and our RP filtration. When we talk about core and catalog equipment, these are standard booths and batch ovens, larger booths like you see for the locomotive, as well as powder booths that are all standard products, pre-engineered, available. We also do, modifications or customizations of these. As that customization gets more involved, then we look more to our engineered project suite. So this is more for very detailed or very specialized booths, like you see the large one here in the center that's used for coating portions of these large oil derricks. Also within this group, we do washers for parts. This is an example of a 3-stage stainless steel washer. This is a 7-stage stainless steel washer. We also do process ovens and manufacture components that we sell through our distributor and integrator partners for process applications. And then the third part of our business is the RP filtration. Colmet acquired Research Products in 2017. We integrated that into our facility in Rockwall, where we manufacture these products. And then last year and this year, we are just focused on growing that product line by adding resources and programs. Colmet is the only spray booth manufacturer that also manufactures filters. And because of that, when you buy our booth, you use our filters, we'll give you a 5-year warranty on the booth and the air makeup unit as well. So today we're going to be talking about compliance. And so we always like to have a disclaimer, because basically, we're not necessarily experts when it comes to OSHA and NFPA. So I would fall into this category of not being an expert. We do have experience from being around it and working through situations with distributors and customers and local authorities to try and help answer questions and resolve it. But again, what we try to do is provide clarity to terms and requirements. We do always suggest that you seek official opinion directly from an approval agency. And then certainly, we would always encourage a relationship with the local authority having jurisdiction, because in the end, they're the one responsible for making a judgment and an interpretation on the code. I think we've heard this many times, that you learn from your mistakes. Certainly, I know this is true for me. Kind of follows along the lines of hindsight 2020. So once you've done something, you can kind of course correct. I think we've all, again, experienced that. Warren Buffett kind of says, hey, it's good to learn from your mistakes, but it's better to learn from other people's mistakes. And so really that's kind of the premise of this presentation, is to say, hey, what have other people had problems with that we can learn from that mistake, and then we can avoid it with our customers or within our manufacturing facility in the future. Basically the way this presentation was born was just looking in Google and searching under OSHA and NFPA code violations in spray booths. And again, so what we're going to do in this presentation is take a look at some of those. So here's an example. Really, when we look at these, the bulk of them will be around OSHA 29, CFR 1910.107. And then there's different subcategories in this, but this is related to spray finishing using flammable and combustible materials. And so in this particular case, you can see that this was a serious violation with a potential fine of $4,900. Now, some of these can be negotiated, and sometimes if you resolve the issue promptly within the timeline and you follow up, sometimes these are waived or can be reduced. But the bottom line is you're looking at a potential $4,900 fine. Now, the violation here was that the interior surfaces of the spray booth were not smooth and continuous. So essentially, this person had some situation. Now, let me just say that the pictures that I've put in here are not the pictures that correlate with this, but these are just examples of pictures that we accumulated. So one of the requirements for a spray booth is that the walls be smooth, that there's no pockets where residue and things can collect and make it difficult to clean. So when you look at the picture on the left, this is a picture that I took at a facility, of course, with permission. It's a very unique situation, and this picture I could use probably in every slide in this presentation to represent some type of potential violation. I mean, somebody was very innovative. They built themselves a nice wooden booth. They did make the opening standard 20 by 20 to accept, filter media. Apparently, they were getting too much airflow with this small fan that they had to block off some of that to restrict the airflow, which is hard to believe, but certainly this would not meet this requirement. So a person in this situation, they would be in potential violation of this thing and could receive a citation, which would be a serious violation and subject to a $4,900 penalty. Now, again, within this picture, there's probably a lot of other things happening there that would not, and we're going to talk about more of those. This is probably a more typical situation that we see here, where they have an existing spray booth, just really poor housekeeping. So now the overspray is built up so much on these walls, but not that this would now be a potential violation. A couple other things to point out. So this booth went in. It appears that at some point somebody modified the booth and added a crane slot. And when Colmet builds a booth, we build them to comply with all OSHA and NFPA requirements. But when a booth gets installed or it gets moved or it gets modified, and maybe the person that does the modification might not be aware of it, now there's potential violation. One of the potential violations here is that how close is the motor that's on the fan behind there? According to code requirements, if that motor's within 3 feet of that opening, it has to be rated for that. So again, sometimes an issue gets created because somebody makes a modification they're not aware of. So one of the benefits of looking at some of these things, again, is to learn from other people's mistakes, is to educate or create awareness within our distribution or with our customers that, hey, these could be potential problems that you want to avoid because, for, a lot less than $4,900 on the situation left, they could have bought a whole exhaust chamber, where they thought they saved money, but obviously they spent a lot of time to do this, but it wouldn't be, pass any codes. Okay, so another example, again, still in violation here. This is another serious violation. This violation is more related to airflow. So to try and just boil down and get to the gist of it, essentially what OSHA says is that the spray booth shall not be less than 100 linear feet per minute of airflow. Now, if you're using electrostatics, you can go down to 60 linear feet. NFP also states that you have to have visible gauges or audible alarm installed to indicate, the air velocity is maintained, or to indicate that maybe your filter media is getting contaminated. So essentially what they're saying here in the details is, one, they didn't ensure that there was effectiveness in controlling the airborne hazards, so they didn't have adequate airflow. Here they say that the booth was at less than 100 linear feet. So what they're saying is that they measured 24 CFM, and they said, hey, the airflow was 0.27 linear feet per minute. So that would be far below. Now, I kind of did the math. Basically, what they had here was probably about 80 square feet of filter media. But it was obviously contaminated, needed to be changed, and they weren't getting airflow. Now, another part of this was that the gauge or the manometer, it wasn't functioning. So they didn't have the oil in it. And we see this a lot. Colmet, again, as far as code compliance, every booth ships with a manometer. Sometimes those manometers don't get hooked up or installed. And, you're looking at a potential $4,900 violation for a manometer, which is under $100 and very simple to set up. The manometer is one of those things, and here's a picture of it here, that everybody should know and feels they should know how it works, but many people don't. So one of the things that we've done to help with that is we've created some videos on our YouTube channel. And so if you want to visit our YouTube channel, Trey Peavy and Casey Carr basically give you an overview on manometer, talk about how to install it, and then how to calibrate it. Additionally, if you need to know more about measuring and checking airflow in the spray booth, Trey also did a YouTube video, I think it's maybe 3-4 minutes long, and he goes through the various tools that you can use to measure airflow, how to use them, and then how to calculate the airflow based on the surface area. So certainly would encourage you to check that out to get a better understanding. Now, again, these pictures that I'm showing don't correlate to that violation, but these are pictures that we've kind of collected along the way. So in this case, you can see that the manometer is mounted inside the spray booth right next to the filters. So obviously that would be handy and very accessible. However, it's not a very good spot to put it. As you can see, it's covered with overspray. So even if it was working, you wouldn't be able to read it. And obviously, nobody's looking at it because those filters there are certainly beyond usable life. So again, this is just to give you an idea of that manometer. Again, very inexpensive solution to avoid a $5,000 fine. Another situation here, again, this was also a serious violation. In this case, basically what they're saying is that the end user did not have a sprinkler system or fire suppression in the booth or behind the filters. So typically the requirements are, and even if you go to NFPA, that all spray booths have to have fire suppression. Now this happens to reference sprinklers, but typically, and again, this is my interpretation, don't take it verbatim, it really is fire suppression. So a way to stop a fire if it were to occur. In this case, this shows an example. This happens to be a dry chemical system where they have a system within the booth and then also within the exhaust stack. And so again, that's a requirement. This is a little more heavy fine. This is $7,000. Reading through this one, it appeared that they had an older booth where they had sprinklers within the spray enclosure, but not in the exhaust stack. And then they had another booth that they didn't have any type of fire suppression equipment. So again, many times we take for granted that people know that, hey, you have a spray booth, you're spraying hazardous materials. There's always a chance for some ignition source in the form of a spark from something, happening. And so you need to have that. So in this example, this was also a serious infraction, potential of $4,900. And this was related to really housekeeping issues in not maintaining a clear space of less than 3 feet on all sides of the booth, free from storage or combustible construction. Now you can see this picture here. Again, this is closer than 3 feet to that wall. These two booths are closer than 3 feet together. There's a lot going on in this picture that just isn't proper. And most likely, if this booth were inspected, they would be cited and have to make some very significant changes. A lot of times we get questions about, well, how close can a spray booth be to a wall? And typically the recommendation is that you maintain 3 feet of clearance, a minimum of 3 feet, on the back and all sides. And if you look further into some of the requirements, it really says 3 feet or 0. So you could put a booth right up against the wall, but then that wall has to be fire rated. But again, in this situation, although these are block walls and that would have a fire rating, there's too much space, which means you can accumulate things back there. And so that's why, this is an issue here. And so again, that's something that could be easily avoided during the planning stages. When we do a larger project, we typically provide the dimension of the booth, we do approval drawings, And then if the customer can provide site information, we can actually, drop the booth into the facility so everybody is clear on where the booth is going to be installed, and that, again, everything as we interpret it is in compliance. This is another example here. So this is related to 107C2, and this talks about minimum separation. In this particular case, again, another serious violation, $7,000 fine, and here they have a whole list of issues. Now, this particular situation is more related to what we talk about as a spray area, and there are some different requirements, but, in this particular situation, they were able to find 5 issues that this person had. And, some of it related to using like a salamander heater, an open flame heater, within 20 feet of this designated spray area. Many times, we see this combination being used. You go into a spray booth or just outside the spray booth, and there's an electric drill that produces sparks, and it's sitting in a bucket of solvent-borne paint. That's, again, a tremendous safety hazard. And then I think everybody also has seen people grinding or welding or doing things, near issues, or near, spray booths or spray areas where there's product sitting out or there's accumulated dry overspray that could easily ignite. And certainly, welding around, loaded up filters is not a good situation because that never ends well. So again, a lot of these things are all related just to housekeeping and good best practices around that. In this particular situation, this kind of continues on with the previous one, and it's talking about combustible residue, that it shouldn't be in the area. And so again, here we had a serious violation, proposed penalty of $5,500, and basically what was happening was there was ignitable residue around and explosive vapors, and they were using, non-rated equipment. Again, a lot of times we see people using auxiliary lighting or halogen lighting, now LED, or radios and things in and around the spray area. Again, I threw this picture back in here because, again, this picture could serve as an example for every one of these situations that we're looking at. To further clarify about spray areas, and this is from NFPA, some of the requirements if you create a spray area. So normally spray areas are used for large parts, so maybe somebody has a 100-foot steel column they want to coat, or they're painting, a large structure. It won't fit in a conventional spray booth, or they don't have room for that, so they create a spray area. So the first thing, again, to kind of boil it down, it has to be constructed of non-combustible or limited combustible materials. The interior surfaces, like the spray booth, have to be smooth and free from areas where things can accumulate. Also, has to be constructed of material that has a fire resistant rating of 2 hours. And this gets back to that 20 foot that you saw, is that the electrical wiring and the equipment used in that area has to be, if it's not approved or explosion proof, it has to be beyond 20 feet. So when you look at this example for a spray area, this little bubble or dome represents the spray area. And so now your area outside becomes Class 1 Division 2. And so that area that's created is 10 feet above it and 20 feet out horizontally. And so for the 10 feet above, what would come into play is the lighting. So if you have standard lighting in a spray area that's within that 10-foot window, it would have to be explosion proof. If it's above it, then you would be okay with just standard lighting. And then again, that also references electrical devices, within 20 feet of the defined spray area. And so this spray area would represent the product that you're spraying, and then this would be where your overspray would be, billowing and potentially fall out. So again, if you have, standard electrical devices, they'd have to be beyond that area. Here's an example of pretty much what not to do with regards to a spray area. So in this situation, they've created a spray area. They've got a small exhaust plenum. They got a stack vented outside, which is good, but they've got a motor here, most likely not explosion proof. There's a series of things. So this is not rated for the area. The lighting most likely, especially this one that would be hanging above the area where they're spraying. Remember, we have that 10-foot vertical zone. That would fall within that, so that wouldn't be approved. Everything else would fall again within the 20 foot. So you've got a compressor here. These walls are not smooth. This glass window doesn't have a 2-hour fire rating. So again, there's a lot of potential issues in this. And, these are things to be aware of when you're, out and about looking at things to help advise customers on the safe way to create these environments for spraying. This is another situation here. Now, in this particular case, this was a serious violation, $4,900 penalty, and what it was related to is so they had the sprinklers in the booth, but they didn't protect them from getting overspray on them. So the requirements are, and I happened to, as I was doing a little research, I found this bulletin from the Minnesota State Fire Marshal, and they were citing NFPA 13, and it was talking about the proper way to protect the sprinkler head. So I thought it was relevant. One way is to use like a paper sandwich bag. They refer to it as thin paper, or a lunch bag, I should say. And the other one is to use a cellophane bag that's 3/1000 or less in thickness. Now, one of the things that I guess I wasn't aware of is that you need to use cellophane, not plastic. So Glad bags, normal sandwich bags are actually plastic. So really the requirement is for cellophane. And I'm sure that has to do with how quickly it could be consumed with the flame so that, not to inhibit the release of the water. And again, many of these things will come down to the authority having jurisdiction. I worked in the a lab for many, many years, and we would have the fire marshal come through, and, one year they would say, yeah, you need to have paper bags. Next year they would come through and say, no, don't use paper, use plastic. So again, some of these things are open to interpretation, but certainly there's information out there, or you can seek guidance from the authority having jurisdiction. But one thing is for sure is that the sprinkler heads need to be protected so that overspray does not accumulate on them. And again, then it inhibit their release based on the designated temperature. Okay, here's another example. And this one, again, another serious violation, $5,500 fine. And basically it says the employer did not ensure spraying is not conducted outside the predetermined spray area. So we see this a lot where people have a spray booth, but they're spraying outside the spray booth. Now, the picture I put up would be probably a drastic example of this. Typically it's somebody just a foot or two outside the width of the booth and they have a longer part. This is a more extreme situation. This is actually a facility I visited. They're complaining about, hey, we're doing spraying, and we have all odors throughout the shop. We've got a exhaust plenum. Well, they did. They have a 20-foot exhaust plenum, but they're trying to spray parts in a 140-foot area. Now, one potential solution would be if they turn these parts perpendicular and they put up curtains and create airflow, or the other option is they need to create, 140 feet of exhaust plenum and then maybe add curtains to help contain that. Anytime, again, that you're going to exhaust that much air, you also have to introduce that much air. Another potential issue that they have here is that when the weather's nice, people leave the doors open. So the booth now is going to draw the air immediately coming in the door, and it's not going to be pulling the vapors that are down at the far end of the parts when they're spraying. Again, another situation here, just to show how prevalent this is, there was no manometer connected. When I walked up to that filter chamber, I took a sheet of paper off my pad of paper, held it up to the filters, and it just dropped to the floor. So the filters are so loaded that it wasn't even exhausting. So again, there's a lot of education that can be done. It's an opportunity to help the customer, but then also to sell them filters and generate some revenue, but also create a safer spray environment. But again, all these basic things that people overlook or maybe aren't aware of, are very easy to fix and, far less expensive than having to pay a fine and then have even more oversight in other areas of the business. So that's kind of, we talked about an ounce of prevention. A little bit of better housekeeping really can save a lot of headaches and potential issues. Here's another example, again, a serious violation, $4,900 fine. And again, this was related to housekeeping. So the employee did not ensure the floor surface of the spray booth was maintained free of an accumulation of combustible residue. And again, this picture we looked at earlier, but we see this many times where, they have a spray booth, but the filter's loaded, it needed to be changed probably a month ago, the walls are covered, and there's just other combustible residue around, paint cans. You can see a trash hopper here with, more debris in it. So, any type of ignition source would really rapidly gain momentum in an environment like that. Kind of to summarize that, why is housekeeping so important? Well, what's the worst case scenario? Pretty much this right here. So this is an example of customer that, now the cause of this thermal incident, as we like to call it, was actually welding, and that's always a concern. But because the booth was dirty, because there was a lot of combustible residue on the floor and the walls of the booth, and because they didn't take the filters out of the booth that were loaded with paint, once they had a stray spark from the welding operation, the booth was a total loss. There was substantial damage to the building. The sprinklers did come on that they had in the booth. It put the fire out relatively rapidly and contained it to that area. But there was water throughout the facility, smoke damage, and it just, fortunately this happened when they were at a slow time, so they were able to rebuild and not impact them. But, again, basic housekeeping, just following some of the basic guidelines of cleaning up, changing the filters, monitoring the airflow in the booth, will help prevent this. So again, just to kind of summarize, when we design a spray booth, it's designed to comply with all the OSHA and FPA standards. We can certainly coach our distributor partners and the customers on where they need to locate that booth when they're in the facility or in their facility, and how to help, follow the guidelines there. But things change. Sometimes the location that's selected for the booth install, it gets moved at the last minute. Sometimes booths get modified. If you think back to that example of that crane slot somebody cut in, and did they consider now that the motor on the fan might be too close to that opening they created, and that would be a place where overspray could billow out. Now, again, not always easy to have a fire. The conditions have to be right, but they certainly happen, and probably too much. So really the purpose of this presentation is, again, learn from some of the mistakes other people made, help you become an advocate for your customer, to help notify them of potential issues and kind of coach them through some of these things. At this point, one thing else to keep in mind is that, again, as stated at the beginning, I'm not an expert, have some experience. There's other people within Colnet that had a lot more experience than me. I just couldn't talk to them in doing this presentation today, but we can certainly help. But the bottom line is the final say comes down to the authority having jurisdiction. Now, who that person is, it could be the local fire marshal, it could be some type of inspector, it changes by area, but it's really up to how they interpret the codes and what they want to see. So certainly when you get involved in a project within a facility, it's better to get them engaged up front to understand how they like things done, because if you do it and, go the route of asking for forgiveness, sometimes it can be much more difficult to get the help or the coaching, because you didn't solicit it up front. So at this time, I'd just like to open it up to see if anybody has any questions.
All right, John, we do have a few questions, but I wanted to mention, please don't forget to download your handout before you leave the webinar. Also, too, want to mention that you will get a certificate of attendance in your thank you email about an hour after this presentation, so don't forget to download that. Okay, now over to questions, John. Our first one is, give me time to read this. It's a little bit long here. Colemet uses the drawers for the spray-to-waste cartridge collectors for powder collection. The end user is asking about replacing those with a cardboard box. Any issue with that? Not sure what the NFPA or OSHA guidelines are with cardboard in a powder booth.
Well, that is a good question, and I don't know if I can properly answer that one. I think what I need to do is maybe do a little homework and get back. I mean, to me, as a best practice, I wouldn't recommend using, paper unless it's rated, non-flammable, or cardboard or even wood inside of a spray booth, something that I would always try and avoid. But Judy, if you would, get me that information, who asked it, and then I'll follow up and, get an official answer back. But yeah, interesting question.
Yep, not a problem, John. I'll send that over to you at the end of today's webinar. A couple more questions here is you mentioned the manometer. What is the best place to mount it? Where is the best place?
Okay, ideally, you want to mount the manometer outside the spray booth. So typically, we mount it outside of the booth on the side of the exhaust chamber. Basically, there's two ports on the manometer. One gets connected inside the exhaust chamber, and then one gets connected into the open environment if it's just an exhaust chamber, or it would get connected into the booth if it's an enclosed booth. But ideally, that's where you would locate it, someplace where it's easily observed and it's not going to be covered with overspray like that example that I showed.
All right. Thank you, John. Another question here. What is the difference between Class 1 Division 2 and Class 2 Division 2?
Okay, so there's a couple things. I mean, this is a good question. This is always kind of a confusing area. So first off, let's talk about Class 1 Division 1. That's typically the area within a spray booth where vapors exist under normal operation. Class 1 Division 2 is normally an area that's adjacent to that, which means that vapors may exist, but they're not commonly there. But now when we talk about, so that's kind of the difference between Division 1 and Division 2. Class 1 relates to liquid. Class 2 relates to powder. So to answer the question, Class 1 is related to liquid, Class 2 is related to powder.
All right, well, thank you, John. Another question here, if sprinklers are required in spray booths, what does a customer do if they do not have existing sprinklers in the building?
Okay, again, another good question because this happens a lot. If there are no sprinklers in the building, again, the best thing to do is talk to authority having jurisdiction to see, hey, what do we need to do? But if you go back to that one example I had earlier, that was actually a picture I got from a company called Kitty, and they basically make dry chemical fire suppression systems. So most likely you would be instructed to go with a dry chemical type system. Typically, that consists of a canister and then some type of a detection system that would then, cause that to release. But best to resort and talk to the authority having jurisdiction.
All right, John, and the last question is, why is the booth airflow requirements lower for electrostatic applications?
Okay, so that's another good question. So typically the reason is because an electrostatic application has a higher transfer efficiency. So more of the paint that you're spraying is actually going on the part, so you're creating less overspray and there's less vapors in the air. It's probably most important, depending on the type of electrostatic, like if you're using a rotary atomizer where you have a softer spray pattern and you depend more on the electrostatic process. So it would be more of a benefit to have lower boot velocity so you're not pulling the paint away from the part. But basically, it comes down to transfer efficiency. More of the paint you spray goes on the part, so there's less vapors and overspray to contain and capture.
All right. Thank you so much, John. That is all the questions. So if you wouldn't mind maybe going to the next slide, please. Just a few more things before we conclude today's webinar. This is the Colemet Who to Call list. As John mentioned, we're not experts, but we can help provide guidance. So if you ever need to contact one of your regional sales managers, on the right is the chart, the map showing their territory that they're responsible for. And on the left is their contact information. It will be part of this presentation when you download the presentation. John, and on the next slide here, I just wanted to mention, don't forget the COLMET website. It's a great resource tool. On the page there on the right, that is, if you go to the header under resources, there's a tab that says webinars. All of these presentations in PDF format have also been put on our COLMET website. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there is a survey that we sent out earlier today that talks about our future COLMET Academy webinars. As I mentioned, we're going to go to once per month. And so we're just trying to determine the best day and time for that. So do appreciate you filling out that survey to help us, as well as tell us some additional topics that you would like to find out more about. And then again, COLMET Academy, the YouTube page, John had mentioned it throughout the presentation. We have a lot of good videos there, not just previous webinars, but we also have a lot of helpful hints, like John had mentioned, on, a manometer, how to do airflow reading, how to calculate that. So please, it's a good resource tool to go to the YouTube site, especially if you have new hires that need to know a little bit of background information. And the next slide, please. And that'll be it. Again, I mentioned about an hour after this presentation is over, you'll receive a thank you note. In there will be a link to get a certificate of attendance for attending today's webinar. And so we thank you again very much for attending, and this will conclude our webinar for today.
Thank you, everybody.